Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today's presentation is one piece of our larger series of expert sessions that are designed to bring users of our IoT and AR products up to speed as quickly as possible. These sessions will cover a large set of topics including design, development, deployment, maintenance, and tips, as well as new capabilities of our software that could benefit you. If you have questions during the presentation, you're more than welcome to type them in our Q&A box. We will be reviewing them live at the end of this presentation. If there is any question that can't be answered live, we will share the answers later along with the recording for this session. This session will be a little bit different because we will have no slide decks. Anjan will cover the building of a simple application directly on Thingworx Composer from start to end in order to illustrate the concepts that we want to cover. So thank you, Anjan, and I'll hand it over to you.
In this session, we are going to create a simple application using the Mashup Builder. This app is going to show the COVID-19 vaccination status for some countries and unions with the data collected from the past 4 to 5 weeks. As we will be looking at the visualization portion of this session, I have pre-created the entity and the data set required to support our mashups. Before we build our app, I'll just talk through the visual workflow. To start with, we will be creating 2 mashups. The first mashup is going to be our base mashup, which will use a list widget to browse through the countries, and we are also going to use 2 types of chart and a grid to display their data. The second mashup will be an entry form of sorts. We will navigate to that mashup through a pop-up and add a new data row. Once we have the app set up, we will then create a style theme to style our application. Let's start by creating our first mashup. I will click on the new button and type in mashups and click on mashup. In this pop-up, we'll make our first choice. The responsive option that's on the left is our new Flexbox-based layout. The other 2 you see are our legacy jQuery-based responsive layouts. For this app, we will go with the Flexbox layout. As you can see, we have 2 required fields in this page. The first one is the name, so let's call this base mashup. And the second one is a project. Starting with the 9.1 release, the project field on entities are a required field. Any entity that is created in Thingworx needs to be part of a project. You can use projects to organize your entities, package them, and deploy using Solution Central. So let's click on this field and create a new project. I will call this demo project and then hit save. Now, when we switch back to our mashup, you can see that that project has automatically been set. The next thing you'll notice here is the set as project context link. When you click on this link, it will set the project we created just now to be the default project for any new entity we are going to be creating in this user session. So let me click on that. That is the same as setting the project context in this new menu. Let's now save and switch to the design tab. Before we start designing our app, I'll take a quick minute to talk about workspaces. You can create multiple workspaces depending on which part of the builder you want to focus. This is purely user-based, so the workspace I create for myself under the admin user would just change my builder and not for others. So as an example, if I want to purely focus on widgets, their properties, and style properties, I can move the Functions and Data tab to the top and move the Cell Properties tab to its own section on the right. Or I can purely focus on widgets and properties by collapsing this to the right, or I can collapse all of them to get more screen real estate. I can go ahead and save this workspace as a custom workspace called WS1 and then click on Done. You can see I can flip back and forth between my custom workspace and the default workspace. All right, so back to our app. The first thing we'll do here is to split our layout. I'll start by going to the Layout tab and adding a right container. Let's now split this right container into 2 by adding a bottom container. Actually, if we're going to add the list widget to the left, I would want the list to be just part of the top half, which means we need to split the whole layout in half. To remove the new container we just added, I can either delete it or use undo to go back a step. Let's now go back to the Explorer tab, make sure container 2 is the selected container, and I will add another bottom. I'll go back to the Explorer tab, make sure container 2 is selected, and then add a top for the header. Now let's fix the size of this header to 65 pixels. So I'll go to the Layout tab, click on Fix Size, and set the height to 65. Let's now add a few widgets. I'll start by clicking on the Widgets tab and searching for the List widget. Let's drag and drop that onto the canvas. The next one to add is the Grid widget. So I'll search for the grid, grab the Grid Advanced widget, and add that to the canvas. Actually, I'd like to move the grid to the bottom and just have the list and the charts in the middle container. So there are multiple ways to move the grid here. One way is to use our cut and paste buttons you see on these toolbars. So I can click on the grid, click on cut, select the bottom container, and click on paste. Let's undo these actions and look at a different way to do this. For option 2, I'll click on the grid, hold the shift key, drag and drop that to the bottom container. What we did here is the same as cut. If I hover over this cut button, you can see that shift is a shortcut to move widgets between containers. Similarly, we can copy and paste too. As the copy button shows, holding Alt and dragging and dropping will create a copy of the widget. The history dropdown keeps track of the last 10 actions, so I can use this dropdown to go back a few steps. In our case, I'll go to the Added Widget Grid section. Let's now switch to the Explorer tab. Confirm container 6 is our bottom container, and now click on the grid and drag drop that onto container 6. You can see this also moved the widget between containers. All right, now back to our app building. Let's fix the size of the container that has the list widget. So let me select container 3, which has the list widget, and I can either use the drag handles to fix the size or go to the Layout tab and set a fixed width. Let me make this 150 pixels. Let's now split the right container into two for our two charts. So I'll select the container and add a right. I'll now go back to the Widgets tab and search for chart. The two types of chart we're going to be using today is the line chart and the bar chart. And last, let's also add a label widget to the top container for our title. It's now time to get data into the builder. I have the entity set up in two ways. I have a data table that has the data for all countries and unions, and I also have individual things representing said countries and unions. Let's get the data table in the builder and bind them to the grid and the line chart. To do that, I'll click on the plus button under the data tab, search for my vaccine data table, and I will grab Get Data Table Entry Service, click on the right to add the service. The checkbox under Execute on Load denotes that this service will trigger on Mashup load, so let's enable that. And click Done. Let's now get the data for the list widget and the bar chart. Since all the country and union things I created is based on a thing template, I'll have to search for that specific thing template. I can either type the name of the template here or filter by entity type, and then choose my entity. The service we need now is called Get Implementing Things. I will add that to the right and click on Done. Since I forgot to check the Execute on Load event, I can go back to the Explorer tab, click on my root mashup, scroll down to the Loaded event, and bind that to Get Implementing Things. For the bar chart, the way we want to drive the data is by making a selection in the list widget and use the name to fetch that country's data. To do that, we need to add a dynamic service. So let's go back to adding a new data, and I will search for one of the countries I've created. Now I'll click on Show Dynamic Services, search for Getstream Data, and click Done. By enabling dynamic services, you can now see that this service now requires an entity name input. What this means is whatever name I pass in, the Getstream Data service will run specifically on that entity and fetch those values. To pass an entity name here, let's go to the Get Implementing Thing service, expand Return Data, expand Selected Rows, and bind the name field to that entity name. There are a few different ways to bind this, and I'll show them. One way is to simply drag and drop. When I grab name, you can see how that the Data tab is now filtering to just show all the valid drop targets. But even in this case, if I hover over some of these headers, you can see how they expand and show me all the other available targets. But this makes this tab busy. I could potentially drop this on the wrong target and create an incorrect binding. So I'll cancel this for now. One other way to bind is right-click on the name, choose Select Source, scroll back up to our entity name property, right-click and select Bind to Target. With this way, the headers won't expand, and you can browse through the data panel to find your right drop target. This is especially useful when you have 7 or more services in that panel. Now we have a name bound, we need an event to trigger when something is selected. Let's now bind the selected rows changed event to our Getstream Data service. I can either drag and drop this event or use our bindings menu. So I'll click on the bindings configuration menu to show this. We can use this filter at the top to search for our specific property or event. Since we know its selected rows changed, I'll go ahead to that event, click the dropdown, and select Add Trigger Service. You'll notice that the right half is now split into 3 tabs: Widgets, Data, and Functions. I'll switch to the Data tab, click on Getstream Data, hit Next, and hit Done to commit the changes. Now let's get data into the list widget. I'll go back to Get Implementing Things, grab the All Data Info table, and drag and drop to the list widget, and click on Data. We'll now have to set the display and the value fields. I can either filter or scroll and find these properties. One other way to find them is to use categories. As you can see, we have multiple categories where these properties have been split up into. For example, Info shows you all the base properties for a widget, which is ID, type, display name, and description. The Bindable category will show you all bindable properties. Let's now select the Data category. This is one of, if not the most important category, as this shows you the key properties for a widget. I will now set both the display name and the value fields to name. And let's go back to the All category. If you notice, the list widget has a row at the top that says None. Think of this as a blank row which you can use to clear a selection on the list. We won't need this for our use case, so I will uncheck that property and also select Auto Select First Row. Next, let's bind data to the bar chart. I grab all data from Getstream Data and bind that to the bar chart. The first thing we'll do is set the number of series to 1. I'll now clear this and flip back to the data category. And for the data field, I will select count. And for the x-axis, I'll select date time. Let's go back to all and also change the type of the chart from bar chart to column so that we have vertical bars instead of horizontal. And I will also check height legend. Let's now get data for the line chart and the grid. I'll expand return data on get data table entries, grab all data, and bind that to both the line chart and the grid. To configure the line chart, let's start by setting the number of series to 6, as we have 6 entities. I'll clear this and switch to the data category. Each data field here is going to represent a country or a union. And the x-axis field is our date time. I'll now go back to the all category, search for x-axis datetime format, and set that to DD MM. Let's now search for y-axis format and remove the decimal from this field. And since I want to make the same change on the bar chart, I can go ahead and click on the bar chart and do the same. You can see that when I clicked on the bar chart, it still retained the filter. Let's do the same for the axis labels. So I will search for x-axis label. Type in date time, copy it, make sure the alignment is set to center, switch to my line chart, go to my label field, paste that, and make sure this is also center aligned. Same deal for y-axis label. So let's search for y-axis label and set this to count in millions. That, switch to my other chart and set the label to that. Let's now change the main label. So I'll search for label and change bar chart to say status per country union, and go to the line chart and change the line chart label to say global status. Let's now switch our focus to the grid. You can see that it brought back a few extra columns like source type and tags, which we don't need to display at runtime. So let's change that. Let's also address the header and cell alignment. To configure all that, we need to go to the grid configuration menu. I can either go to the config menu by clicking on the drop down here and choosing configure grid columns, or clicking on this configure icon in the properties menu. I'll now uncheck the columns we don't want to display and also change the header and cell alignment. We want to set both to center. And the last one to center. And then click on done. After we hit done, the grid preview in design time now shows us the difference. Finally, let's click on the label widget and change the label text to say COVID-19 status, and switch to the Style Properties tab, expand base, expand label, and set the font size to 42 pixels. To center align this widget, let's click on the container, switch to the Layout tab, scroll down, and choose the middle options for the Align and Distribute. Let's now go ahead and view our mashup. On the left, you can now see our list widget being populated, the line chart showing the global status, and the bar chart on the right showing data specific to Brazil. So when I switch to EU, we should see the data for the bar chart change. Instead of showing the bar chart, maybe we can have it hidden and expand on row selection. To do that, let's go back to Design Time, go back to the Explorer tab, and click on the container that has the bar chart. Now we'll go to the Properties tab and click on the Enable Expand and Collapse property. This will allow us to expand and collapse the entire container. I'll now uncheck Expanded so that the bar chart container is collapsed initially. Now to trigger this expand, we need to bind an event. To do that, let's go back to the Configure Bindings menu, click on the drop-down for Expand, choose Add Event Trigger, and use a Selected Items Changed event, and hit Next, and click Done to commit the changes. Let's now go back to the List widget and uncheck Auto Select First Row, and go ahead and save and view our mashup. You can see that on mashup load, this container is now collapsed, and when I select an item, it expands to show that specific data. Let's now go back to the composer and create our second mashup. I'll click on New, type in mashup, choose responsive, and call this Popup mashup, and save and go to the Design tab. This will be our Popup mashup where we can use data entry fields to add a new row to the data table, and then have both the grid and the line chart to update that at runtime. So as we'll have a total of 8 fields, I will go to the Widgets tab, search for text field, and add 7 text fields. Add a datetime picker. And finally, add a button to trigger our service. Let's now switch to the Layout tab and make the view vertical to see all of our fields. I'll next click on the plus under Data, search for my data table, grab the Add Data Table Entry service, and then hit Done. The next thing we need to do is bind all these fields to the corresponding field in the value. So first, I will go ahead to these fields and then add a label to them so I know what fields they are. So click on the first one, and I will search for label. Call this one ID. Now that I've set labels for all of them, I will bind them to the corresponding fields. And I finally grab datetime and bind that to datetime. One other way to do the same thing is I can click on the Add Data Table Entry Services, go to Data Properties, go to the Bindings menu, and add my binding for all the text fields I see on this one screen, and then I can click on Done. Since I'm in this menu, I will also add the button trigger. So I'll click on the dropdown in the header, click on Add Event Trigger, and in my Widgets tab, I will search for the clicked event for the button, select that, hit Next, and then click on Done. I'll now rename the button's label to say Save. The next thing we need to do is maybe add a status message to let us know that the save has been triggered. So to do that, let's go to the Functions tab, click on plus, search for status message, and give this a name. Click on Next, and let's call the message as saved, and then hit Done. I'll now grab the clicked event from the button and bind that to the show message event in the status message. So whenever I click save, it will both trigger the add data table entry service and also triggers the status message. Let's now save this mashup and go back to our base mashup. To bring this pop-up up, we'll need to add a navigation function to navigate to this mashup. To do that, let's go to the Functions tab, click on the plus icon, choose the navigation function, give that a name, click on Next. And under Target Mashup, let's choose our pop-up mashup. And the type is going to be a pop-up. Let's leave the defaults and click on Done. So now we need a way to update this mashup whenever we close the pop-up. So let's expand this navigation function. Find the window closed event. Drag and drop to our Get Data Table Entry service. So that when we close this pop-up, the service will be called and both our chart and the grid will update. We also need a way to trigger this navigation pop-up. So we can either add a button to trigger it, or for our app, we can maybe use a double-clicked event from this list widget and bind that to the navigation. So let's just do that. So let me grab the double-clicked event, go into Functions, and drop that onto the Navigate service. Now let's save and view our mashup once again. So you can now see clicking on this will expand it once, but when I double-click it, it opens up the pop-up. Let's now add a new entry to the grid. So I'll call it ID 5 and give values. And I'll click Save and close the pop-up. You can now see that a new grid row has been added and the line chart has been updated. Finally, let's change some colors by using themes. So I'll switch back to the composer, click on New, search for Style, and choose Style Theme. I'll give this a name, hit Save, and switch to the Styles tab. I'll now expand colors and background colors and give this a color. You can see the changes on the right on the theme preview mashup, which is an out-of-the-box mashup we provide. You can clear this mashup assignment and assign your own mashup to see live updates. Let's now go to the text section and set all labels to Century Gothic. While we're here, let's also change the button, grid, and the list. So to get to them, I'll scroll down to the element section, expand buttons, get to primary buttons, and change from blue to red. I'll then scroll down to grids, change the main row background to maybe a lighter shade of blue, and then change the title to a darker shade. I'll also change the title row label to white so that there's a contrast in the header. So I'll save this theme. And then switch to the grids and list tab, and we can see the update right there. So for the list, I'll expand the list section, change the main row to maybe a different shade of blue, and change the hover background to red. Any updates you make here will also be reflected onto the mashup we have on the right. Let's now scroll to the chart section, expand series 1, and change this to yellow. So if I now switch to the charts tab, you can see the sample charts we have for multiple series. In our case, I've just changed it series 1, so you can see value 1 is now yellow. So I'll save our theme and switch back to the base mashup. I'll now go to the Explorer tab, click on the root mashup, switch to the Style Properties tab, and set the theme we just created. I'll then select the grid, go to the Properties tab, scroll down to find the Use Theme property, and check that. Now you can see both the grid preview and the background showing us the updates. Let's now view the mashup. You can now see our label font changed, the list and the grid with different colors, and hovering is now red, and when I then click an item, our charts have yellow bars. To just show the difference, let me switch back to design time and choose a different theme that I created. And save and view this mashup again. You can see the change in colors. That concludes our demo. Thank you for watching.